Thank you, Kate, for joining us together for this webinar. I think that we are all looking forward to hear from you. And perhaps because not everybody knows you, just why don't you introduce yourself briefly and then start, okay? And the other thing is, would you like people to interrupt you, or you want all the questions by the end? What would you prefer?
Yeah, I'm happy to have, I would say, questions of clarification during the presentation. If there is something that isn't clear or somebody is inspired, which would be lovely, and feels they need to make a comment. And then hopefully I manage to get through in the 30 minutes that I have planned, and then we also have time for discussion.
Okay, great. Right.
So if somebody has something they would like to intervene, I'm very happy.
Okay, and I'll appreciate if everybody switch off their microphones so that we don't have echoes, and only use them when they want to speak. So just put your hands up whenever you want to talk to Kate, and it's all yours, Kate.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Kate Farrell, which plain say if you want to say it in Irish. And I'm also coming to you from Colombia at the moment. I am trained in political science, biochemistry, economy, political economy, agronomy, and urban management. I have this in my mind in Spanish at the moment, I apologize. And I am also, from my time when I started out in biochemistry and moved over to political science, and what I discovered when I met when I met Elena, and actually before, I should say I'm a little nervous because there's a lot of people I admire a great deal in this room, and I'm a little bit scared to talk to them about what they know a lot about, and I am an interloper. So I met Elena in Berlin many years ago, and we hit it off. I had met Stafford's work many years earlier, and I would say I'm an organic complexity theorist of a rather eclectic nature. And so I've done a lot of reading in a lot of different fields. Generally speaking, what I describe myself as is an ecological economist. And I focus on the way in which economic systems and ecological systems can be better synchronized. So the aim for my talk today is to touch on this question of the inadequacy of the current iteration of humanity for sustaining humanity. Somebody in the chat. Yeah, I have a problem with my microphone. So I think what I will do is turn off my camera, and hopefully that helps me a little bit. Can you hear me enough? Yeah, I apologize. I'm in the majority world, and I have some technical limitations at the moment. So, apropos, I will jump into this first image, which is a clock from Switzerland that was gifted to Colombia, to the people of Bogota, by, yeah, if other people turn off their video, probably it also helps. I'm sorry for that. And it does not work. So I start off with this observation because this is a part of the challenge that we are facing in sustainability, the way in which we approach problems. And I hope to be able to highlight a bit the way in which, building on my interpretation of some of the work of Bateson and some of the work of Beer and work of some other people, the nature of this problem. But I think this image, which I developed for another talk, is very fitting because we can have the best of intentions to try and set up very good systems. But if we don't take into account in the design of those systems the social context within which those systems are existing and to be used, then our expectations about what's going to happen, how those systems will work, are going to be well above what really can happen. And so that's sort of the general take-home message I hope to provide in this talk. So I have said I'm going to talk about the incomprehensibility of contemporary problems and how Bateson, Beer, and a couple of others can help us with that. So what do I mean by that incomprehensibility? Well, I'd like to share with you this brief little video from a mentor of mine, who is Kosa Mayumi. And for that, I have to share with you also the sound for a second. So I will do that. Share with you. I hope that you are able to see now the video of Kosa. Yeah. You are able to see the video of Kosa? Yes?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Now we will do a Zen Buddhist lecture on zero emission with a collaboration. When I say so, please stop breathing. Now. Now let's start something else.
Stop. Just give me 5 seconds, and I guarantee you will be.
Okay. I know it seems a little bit silly, the talk from Koso. We'll stop sharing my sounds with you. So give me a second so you don't have to hear my signals. I find it a very helpful illustration of the madness of many of the objectives and the aims, just like expecting the Swiss clock to maintain itself in Bogota, that are connected with our ideas about how to address the challenges of the Anthropocene. So to deepen a bit our reflection on that, if we look at, and this is related to my interpretation of Bateson's work, the nature of the Anthropocene, what we can see is that humanity is really trying to figure out a 21st century problem with a pre-industrialization brains. And we have augmented enormously our capacity both to create and to understand those problems through computers. But we are still using our brains to understand what the computers are doing. And so I use the metaphor of a few minutes after a crash on the motorway when we think about what's going on. The thing we should be surprised about is that we expect to know what's going on. Instead, if we take seriously what we know about human nature, we should be looking at the relationship between our bonobo side and our chimpanzee side, and asking ourselves, how can we work with what we have? How can we build strategies based on who we actually are? And at the moment, we are much more heavily oriented, including in modern science, on the chimpanzee side, I would argue. Added to this is the problem that within the last 20 years, we have completely transformed the way in which we think, both individually and in groups. This has consequences for how we think and also for what we think about. So we now think through mobile phones. Agriculture, which is a fundamentally social activity for millions of years, as humans cultivated in many forms as hunter and gatherers, and more recently in thousands of years with the settled cultivation, is now a very individualized activity. We also have the world of money, which is connected between the two, very individualized activities connected with a lot of informatic infrastructure. Some people are trying to respond to that. This is a reflection circle of people from many different religions together, brought together by a Native American community. But all of this is also happening in a massively remote connected world. So basically everything about how we have gone about thinking in groups has changed structurally and in very important ways, and very, very quickly. Science is not keeping up with this. This is NASA, and I am a big fan of NASA. I love this website. It looks like it's moved on at least to circular instead of square, but what we can see is that we are still in boxes. They're just round boxes. And while this work is very important, I don't mean to suggest it isn't, it has not kept up with the changes that are occurring in the world that we are experiencing and creating. This is an image from the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is similar to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Transnational scientific projects, great efforts to try and make sense of what's going on, but failed miserably in terms of being able to give us concrete, coherent strategies for responding. And that's not news to any of you. But another aspect of the problem that we have here is that science is also not reaching out. So efforts to construct projects that are deeply engaged with local communities, like this one that's reflected in the photo of myself with Manuel Marquez in Pueblo Viejo, are not getting onto the ground. And most importantly, they're not connecting up through what I would like to call here in our conversation today, the holarchy of collective cognitive sense-making in the Anthropocene. So we have the scientists still all in their boxes, we have our programs and plans, but the distance between those boxes at NASA and the real lives of real people living in places of conservation is still enormous, not just in physical space, but also in ways of knowing and thinking. So if we are going to try and solve the problems of the Anthropocene, I would like to suggest we would do well to remember the old adage, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. So if we are not taking into account at the start of this project, what is the task, we are not going to design good strategies. And here the task is to imagine and explore how sustainable development is possible, which is different from what it is. And again, I know this is an audience that's aware of that. I would like to add to that the work of Ilya Prigozhin, who gives us a very important reflection. And Prigozhin received the Nobel Prize in the 70s for his work on far from equilibrium thermodynamics. And he would be a contemporary of the cyberneticians, also working within these contexts. He has a different position on information and entropy, but we don't have to go into that. So Prigozhin calls to our attention that in far from equilibrium systems, and all living systems have these characteristics, we are not able to say exactly what the system will do, but we are able to talk about how the system will do. How are the ways in which it goes about? And this is where cybernetics gives us some really powerful tools that I would like to suggest we could be using in ways that perhaps we're not using at the moment. Biological complexity, the complexity of living systems, and I would argue also of the system of making sense of our role in the Anthropocene is relational. This is the Colonna ant, which is very popular in Colombia, in her habitat here with her colony, and here connected with the food system in Colombia because it's a delicacy. And here, moving between the two systems, even the gender of this object has changed. The relationship is what defines the object. The lung is a system, is an organ within a system, within the body, that is extremely simple because of its positioning within a complex whole. So if we try to duplicate it outside the body, it's very difficult. But inside the body, it's making use of muscle, bone, and blood. Again, complexity in biological systems is relational. I would argue all complexity is relational, but then I get into problems with the mathematicians, so I'm not going to say that, and especially not here. Although I guess I just did. So this brings us to think about a particular characteristic of human biology, which is the place I want to focus in my talk today, which is cognition. And human cognition is postnatal in its ontogeny, meaning that humans are not thinking humans when they are born. So we go through a series of stages, and the second two of these stages, but even the first, depend on connecting and relating to other humans. In this respect, it makes no sense to talk about the way in which individualized humans think. So when we think about the mobile telephones, for example, the point being that we are not individualized, we are just losing track of our relations to others. And finally, this capacity to cooperate is bound up in being a full adult. So we can say that this externalized world, this exosomatic morphology, is a fundamental part, not just of human context, but of being human. And it's a subtle but important distinction, which I think is compatible with it's incompatible with my reading of Bateson and my reading of Beer, and I have a couple of others I hope to invite to the party. So when we ask ourselves this question, what is this endo-exosomatic evolution in the human being? Well, the human being is constructing a social context within which human evolution is taking place. Now, I would argue that our capacity to manipulate that process at the moment is quite limited. But this is a process that has been going on for millions of years. And so that means that we need to take into account the way in which we got to where we are. The mechanisms of change that specify the how do we do, as opposed to the what do we do. So this is an example that I have developed based on my interpretation of Georgescu-Roegen's work, Nicolas Georgescu-Roegen. He uses the example of the ant as a social entity. And the ant has this physiological endosomatic morphology of differentiated roles. But humans also have differentiated roles, but we differentiate outside the body. So by our uniform, by certificates, by authorizations. In this respect, human morphology is exteriorized. So we must think about the social cultural relations as part of our physiology. So Bateson has us already on this narrative where he begins to open up this space for us to think about problems of epistemological error and how to correct epistemological error. And he brings us, I would argue, into a very similar space, calling on us to start asking questions about the way in which making sense of reality is bound up with the way in which our brains actually work. Building from this, we can start thinking about the need for a distinction in science between prediction and choice. So prediction assumes that I'm in a non-fuzzy situation. In a fuzzy situation, far from thermodynamic equilibrium, prediction does not make sense. What makes sense is to have an array of possibilities, which include novelty, and to start talking about which one of them we are interested in choosing. This brings in a whole set of political issues, which I don't suggest that I can resolve in the short talk that I hope to have now, so that we can also have a conversation. But it implies a fundamental shift in what we consider to be the project of science. Here we have both an ethical and an epistemological challenge. So our historical experiences of reified institutions that influence how the challenge of the Anthropocene is conceived and how the challenge of the Anthropocene is conceived in turn influences perceptions of historical experience. How we understand our relationship to now shapes how we are going to be able to contribute to the creation of our future. And here there's a quote from Michel Foucault that I find very inspiring. And I think it helps us to see what is the task. And in this respect, it also highlights why I think that this talk is about Bateson and beer, although perhaps you're not yet convinced. And that being that we need to start constructing ontologies that include us. And that means us as scientists and analysts, as well as us as system creators. So Dewey, Bateson, and Luhmann have all got us working on pieces of this, and I'm going to try and spin through briefly where and how I see the connections between the three of them, and then move on to Holarchies and the viable system model. So if we are trying to respond to the climate crisis, I have the question, are we there yet? Have we gotten there? Are we actually capable of treating this as a response? And here we have these images of the Earth Observatory of NASA, of the collapse of an ice shell. And this quote for me is really bone shaking. This glacial scientist in shock, more or less, about the collapse of this shelf. And it's in an article where he's talking about the collapse of a lot of shelves. There are a lot of signals coming from a lot of different directions that everything is falling apart. But we are stunned, we are incapable of responding. And so my question becomes why, and how can we address that? This is a scientific representation that's very popular at the moment about the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. Helps us to understand why it's not just about stopping production, it's about increasing sinks, and it's also about shifting the balance. This is a very popular narrative, but it's completely useless. It gives us very little information about what we should do. And this is very typical of the types of indicators that we are using, creating, and not being able to address problems as a result. Another indicator that you can see here is the map of Peter's projection, which helps us to remember the shape of the planet. I had a long conversation with someone about whether or not to include this. They said it's very imprecise, but this is a part of the point. If we are dealing with a fuzzy reality, we have to deal with a series of different fuzzy representations. Seeking to make a clear and precise representation of a fuzzy reality is absurd. This brings us to zero emissions, which is madness. So if we take the previous indicator of the limits of the support of CO2 production of the planet, and we apply them against this map, what we can see is that out of all the countries of the planet, there are 51 here that have no data. Of these 51 countries that have no data, 63% of them are on the continent of Africa. If this representation were proportional, 28% of the countries with no data would be African. Why is this important? It's important because we are not only creating data that is content poor, it is also unjust. So we have epistemological and ethical problems. Another example of this is the recently elected Vice President of Colombia, Francia Marquez, who you can see here. And Francia Marquez is very famous across the world now, in the Spanish-speaking world, in particular for her phrase, "Pa vivir sabroso." And a lot of people get very excited and they say, oh, look, people in the tropics, they live well. It's nice to have open air and not have many things. She is a winner of the Goldman Prize, but Mahatma Gandhi, she is not. So Francia Marquez is responding to the assassination of environmental leaders, which is a global problem, of which Colombia is one of the leading situations, I guess we could say. So why are the leaders of environmental justice being assassinated in Colombia? They're being assassinated because they are confronting a system that is intimately bound up with the industrialized agricultural system, which is intimately bound up with seeing the world in boxes. This is a social leader. I include her photo here because I won't go into the details of what happened, but I think she is looking at us in a way that says, and what are you going to do? So now I want to revise briefly these three perspectives that I have promised to cover. So from a Deweyan perspective, we can talk about reality itself being relational. Dewey's work is very consistent with Goethe's work on color and his critique of Newton. And it comes down, I would argue, to this negation of a distinction between object and subject when we're talking about the act of observation. So for Dewey, we can talk about a choice to focus on what is accessible to the observer, while there's a seeking to amplify that. And so what does this have to do with a critical ontology of ourselves, of a hermeneutic moment, as I'm calling it here? But Dewey is saying to us, we need to behave like adults. We need to be aware that we exist and that we are participating in creating understanding. Bateson, in his exploration of the concept of schismogenesis, I'm sure I'm saying it wrong, I'm sorry, also brings us into this space of relational creation. Again, objects and subjects are both involved in creating self, other, and the relationship between the two. So it's not considered to be exclusively choice of one or another group. It's a question of the way in which context is created. And also Bateson particularly calls us to start thinking about the responsibility that exists in choosing how those relations are going to be configured. And finally, Luhmann also brings us into this relational space with his concept of resonance, which is a major theme in his text, Ecological Communication, where the coherence of systems internally and with respect to their relationships to other systems depends on this ability to generate resonance, to have a relationship. And for me, the hermeneutic moment there is this opportunity. And I hope that this is part of what gives us some pathways forward of being able to exploit and create levels of meta resonance. I'm aware that this is a somewhat unconventional reading of Luhmann, so I'm happy to go into that if there's interest. For the moment, I'm going to skip on because I want to get to beer and then to conversation. So my aim here is to suggest that one of the ways to think about the viable system model is as a holarchy, and that thinking about it in this way can strengthen our ability to reflect on its applications. So holarchy and holism is a term that was used by Koestler in the end of the 60s about social psychology, where he aims to identify this impossibility of separating the part from the whole and instead understanding that the part is involved in constituting the whole. This is, I believe, quite consistent with VSM, and I think most here will agree with me on that. So if we bear in mind that the construction of niches, sorry, I still have a bit of Spanish in the slide, I missed that, is something very natural in the physical world, and that is the case. We can imagine that construction of niches under biologically fortuitous ecological contexts leads to great results, like the way in which the beaver creates these little dams up in the northwest of the US that feed and benefit the ecosystem. However, this same beaver, in a place where the beaver doesn't belong, being a form of contamination, can create huge damage. And here the human being, probably the only other animal that gets close to the beaver, is also involved in this niche construction with positive and less positive results. This is a house in Ireland. In Ireland, a traditional house in Ireland. In Ireland, you don't live in a house like this without fire. But when we think about the bizarre nature of the behavior of humans with respect to fire, we can see that humans have moved this towards electricity, and our manipulation of fire has really caused a lot of trouble. Okay. I want to bring into this the idea of the modeling relation of Rosen, and I have these two images because the part on the left I think is a fantastic text, but the image is not great. So I wanted to make sure to cite this text, which I recommend if you're interested in Rosen, that you explore if you haven't done so. And on the right is where I'm going to focus what I want to address, which is that while we're in the process of creating scientific knowledge and transdisciplinary and transformative scientific knowledge, we are constantly bound up in this process of coding and decoding, of interpreting, representing, and reinterpreting. And if we don't make explicit that process will make us. So I wish to try and highlight this issue that we need to make much more apparent and visible the nature of the way in which our existing scientific knowledge systems are constraining and encumbering our capacity to make sense of the problems of the Anthropocene. There are many different ones. There are economic ones, social ones, political ones. So if we take the idea of the holarchy and we run that up against the viable system model, I believe that we can see very clearly that the viable system model is a holarchic configuration. And it is something that is there in the texts, but I have found in my readings of people who are picking up on this discourse that it's not so strongly highlighted. Why might that help us? How could that benefit us? Well, Beer in this lovely book from the 70s talks about the problem of the different ways that we try to control that we try to control natural variety. And he talks about the dangers of killing the cat, that it's a good way to control variety, but it kills novelty. And killing novelty in living systems is a very serious problem because living systems remain alive through novelty, and they will resist having that novelty killed. So we end up with a huge range of perturbations. And I see the holarchic representation as a way to think through and to design using the viable system model. I'm going to try and close up here, just giving you an illustration of one way in which I have tried to do that. So here's a Walker on Beer on Ashby. I love this quote. So the question of decentralization is not optional, is a way that I would paraphrase this. So what can we do about that? If we take this subset of relations, which I assume here I don't have to explain, and we treat it as a holarchy, well, what we can see is that the connections between system one and the meta system are coherent and complete. They are holarchical in very much the way that that Koestler talks about. But we also have holarchical dynamics at the level of relationship to environment. So when we talk about what is environment, we have environment for the system in question, but the system in question is also environment for the system one systems. This creates a different way of thinking about how resonance and coherence can be generated across a system or a set of systems. And this is an example. I apologize, this is old material, it's all in Spanish, so it's difficult for me to have translated it, but it's more about the relational objects here. This is about changing a curriculum, but it's particularly and precisely about not changing the curriculum, but using the curriculum structure, using the VSM, and trying to design a way to take existing courses in an established university and construct a new mode of certification that exploits relationships between them. And those relationships, as you can see on the right-hand side, are designated using the VSM. This is another slide which I think, for the moment, I'm going to try to explain briefly. It's my 64-quadrant 5-dimensional matrix that brings us at the end to the box DD at the bottom right-hand corner, which is doing evolution. And the idea is that when we are trying to talk about how to articulate values, we need to take into consideration that we are doing this within a system that we have built that is building us. Mark Kruse gives us the example of technology as ideology, which helps to configure how we might think about this. And he reminds us that modern industrialized science has very particular characteristics that are intimately bound up with the problems of the Anthropocene. In this world, science has a different role. It's involved in defining not only the real, but the good. It's involved in a process of valuation and value judgment that we are not necessarily as scientists prepared, trained, or competent to navigate. And this leaves me with some issues and challenges. And it's there that I would like to close. Sorry, a few minutes over what I wanted. And this is a recipe for action. So we need to understand that we're in a world of post-truth politics, where facts have been replaced by values, and representing values is a logical political strategy. We are facing the Disneyfication of indigeneity. It's happening also with the work of Francia Marquez. So it's symbolic and the content is lost. And we're dealing with post-humanism and the question of what does it really mean to deal with post-humanism? And we lose our footing. Hello? Okay. So I propose as an antidote to this, what I pick up from Geertz, his discourse on anti-relativism. We can talk about anti-humanism. So we exceptionalize humans, not because we are better or more important than other systems, but because we cannot escape being contextualized. And when we think about the relationship between humans and other non-humans across the planet, we must think about modern industrialized technology, the modern political economy, and scientific knowledge production. Which brings us to what I would propose is a Kantian aesthetic ethic, where we have a responsibility to seek out beauty and love. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. So, okay, who would like to comment, ask questions, engage with Kate's suggestions and reflections? Alfredo. You need to.
Maybe
unmute.
may I?
I thought that Alfredo was gonna. Yeah.
Alfredo, we don't have your mic.
What is the difference between a hierarchy and a recursive structure? They're very similar. In a recursive structure, you're part of that, part of the whole. So a holon is just a different name, or as an extension?
It's a great question. Thank you. My interpretation of Kürstler on this is quite particular. He's very clear on this in the texts from the 60s. The difference with a holarchy is the holarchy is involved. It's the relationship in the real time. So it's not recursive. It's not over time. It's in real time. You can think about, for example, the tension between the lung and the breastbone and the muscles. So the body is involved in something where the subset is constituting the next level. Another example would be the fractal nature of leaves. So the actual physiological composition of the leaf is an amplification of the subsystems. So the subsystem's physical structure constitutes the next level system physiology. So it's not recursive, but it's immediate in its structural role. I don't know if I've done Kürstler justice, but I can send you the text as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have to think about what you said. It's pretty deep. So
Yeah, sorry.
I can understand there's no time involved, so the subset is somehow the set. The set cannot exist without the subset, and the subset obviously cannot exist without the set. So there's a sort of relationship, like the yin and the yang sort of relationship. One needs the other to exist. Yes?
Yes, I would say we could think about it, take that metaphor, we could say the yin, the yang, and the yin yang.
And
so there's the three objects, the yin, the yang, and the yin yang.
Oh, and the yin yang is the total.
Right.
Yeah.
So this would be more along the nature of holarchies, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Angela, may I?
Yes, please.
Okay, I have, because as you know that I have to quit something earlier. With such big, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes? It's okay, good. Recently, I finished a long text on Anthropocene and complexity. My point is, what about operationalization? This is those boxes with arrows and so on. For me, I don't put in doubt the value of Stafford Beer's schemes, but at such a large scale, this is just the words. Parole, parole, parole. What about the operationalization of all those things? What is your opinion about this holarchy, hierarchy, etc.? Thank you.
Thank you. If you can put the information about your book in the chat, or better yet, give us access, because I am not with lots of resources at the moment. I'm very interested to see your book. Thank you for mentioning that. I would say part of what I'm trying to put on the table, and this goes to why I have Bateson with me here, is that operationalization is something that has to be done by humans. So part of operationalization is about getting on the ground, in the field, talking to the right people about the right issues. And we are doing a lot of operationalization at the moment for creating the current version of the Anthropocene, but it's a disaster. And so from my point of view, to respond to what I think is the question, and I think it's a very important one, it's back again to this ethical and epistemological challenge to make this jump, to recognize that the processes are not external to the creation of the Anthropocene. And this is something, okay, I look forward to it. Please make sure that you do a metaphor on top when it's ready. I want to see it. We can think about the work of a German thinker who, I don't know if maybe you're familiar with the work of Rudolf Barrow, or anyone here has ever heard of Rudolf Barrow. John Lee has heard of Rudolf Barrow. And so one of the things that Barrow talks about is what he calls die Reise nach innen, the journey to the inside. And part of what he raises for us is this question of what about making real change happen in the real world? Exactly what you are bringing up, and I very much agree. It's very important. And it brings us back to Margaret Mead also in a way. So where does real change come from? At the end of the day, real change comes from people changing what they are doing. And if people will change what they are doing, they need to reflect differently on what they are doing. So what it seems terribly esoteric and not so practical and so to bring that into a business model setting, for example, I think there is a great opportunity at the moment. Munich Re and a lot of big trading companies and a lot of countries with sovereign wealth funds are interested in making investment into sustainability. They don't know how to do it. They are open. So this is for me about exploiting potential points of mega resonance in a Luhmannian sense, looking for ways to engage with the narratives that are coming up and getting in there so that those people are changing the way that they're experiencing their action in the world. I don't know if this responds to your question, but
thank you very much. Thank you. It's inspiring. Your presentation was very inspiring for me. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I have John Lee and Brian.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know.
Brian.
Oh, sorry, you are moderating. Thank you.
Can I talk?
Yes, John. Yes.
Okay, I loved your talk. Saying you're an ecological economist is what I wrote about 15 years ago about using BSM. So I couldn't agree with you more. Rudolf Barrow was a radical who was one of the people who founded the Green Party in Germany. And the German Greens in the 1980s were preaching exactly what you're talking about now. You've got to have internal growth to be able to have external control of your reality. You cannot have the corporate capitalist system go crazy and have you not have a response. And you have to deal with that in your life. That is so German that I'm just going to say I was born in Munich. Okay, so I have three things I want to say. The first is the distinction between the mind and the brain. The brain is the physical thing in your head. Your mind is your social phenomena. The second thing is the reality of evolution between analog and digital. So we are continually confronted with reality. And then we make an analysis of it and we act and we're wrong and we have to deal with the consequences, and then we do that again. The US Air Force jet pilots are taught ODA, observe, orient, decide, act, observe, or they do that once a second. We do that faster than that. That is the key to our consciousness. My final point is that evolution has created dissatisfaction. And so that's what drives evolution. So I leave you with one of my favorite quotes from E.O. Wilson that I think you basically gave in the beginning of your talk. Paleolithic emotions medieval institutions, and godlike technology. It is terrifically dangerous, and it is now approaching a point of crisis overall. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you, John. So you want to engage, or shall we listen to Brian? What do you want? Listen to Brian. Okay, Brian.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yep.
Great. So I warmed to your energy, Katharine, in that talk, but I don't have time to go into detail. But I think your basic point is we're not handling the Anthropocene very well at the moment. Now, there were two guys responsible for that term, one of whom died 2 days ago. The guy who died 2 days ago is famous for this diagram in the paper of which he was lead author. His name is Will Stephan, a famous, great, kind climate scientist. One of the things that came up in the tributes to Will Stephan was a clip where he says, at this moment in history, this is a fairly recent clip, things are chaotic in terms of what people are doing with this problem. He said he finds this very optimistic because chaos precedes reaching a tipping point, maybe in society to head off the climate hitting a tipping point. So I was encouraged by him taking an optimistic view of the mess that we're in.
I'm reminded the character in Chinese for opportunity and disaster is the same character.
Yeah.
But you have that option. And then,
Crisis
so,
is an opportunity. May we live in interesting times, which is also a curse.
yes, precisely. This is, I think, one of the points here, but we need to catch up. And I would say particularly the cybernetics community needs to catch up because they need us now. They may not know it yet, but it's exactly what cybernetics has to offer that is what is lacking in being able to surf this cascade and come out alive, or at least human, actually. I think alive we might do, but we might lose the human process. It's actually what worries me the most.
I would like to ask you a question, Kate, because, for instance, in the work that you did in Magdalena University, that we also collaborated at some point, you have a very clear exposure to using the BSM in practice and the way that you use it in the university. How can you describe in simple words, intuitively, how do you see the complementarity in a real case application of the BSM, the complementarity of using the BSM to understand the university's sustainability strategy and research strategy, and what would be Bateson's complementarity in that situation? How do you see Bateson's way of thinking complementing and enhancing the learning that we have from using the BSM?
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I think my experience of working with the BSM here at the Uni Magdalena has been very positive in seeing that for me as a theorist, it helps me enormously to create design recommendations that are meaningful to the organization. So I had a conversation with somebody the other day, and they were telling me about these courses that are on offer here and how there are different courses in different faculties that are used to make the sustainability seal, and that this is a great thing. And I said, yeah, I'm glad you find it's working out well. I was involved in creating it. And so you could see if things go into a viable system context effectively, then people pick them up and they become natural, obvious to that context. So I think this is one of the things I have seen. The other thing that I've seen is that, in the meanwhile, I've learned much more about it, but basically 2, 3, 4 is where the trouble is. And I think this is related also to Bateson, because Bateson, also Luhmann, and I would bring Luhmann into this. I think he has a great deal to offer here. The problem is that my interpretation of Luhmann is not compatible with the dogma. The Luhmann dogma, by definition, is quite heavy. So it's a question of communication. And it's a question of how does communication constitute the holarchy? And so here in Colombia, but I would say Colombia is really just a distilled version of the rest of the world. One of the things that we have, and this is why I bring in Marcuse and the madness of industrialized modernity, and there's so much communication happening that we are not conscious of, that we are not conscious of our role in communicating, nor are we conscious of the way in which people are communicating with us, intuitively, implicitly, by framing and structuring. And I think what Bateson does is he invites us and he gives us concrete tools to make much more explicit the way in which how I formulate my expressions is bound up with how the world in which I am situated is being constituted. And I'm very aware that there's probably people here who are much better Bateson scholars than I am, so I'm timid to go much further than that. But my feeling at this stage, and based on what you've said about the work here, is that Bateson and perhaps Mead also, and I think also Dewey, they help us to make this internal narrative more explicit, and also to recognize this aspect of environment, which I think is quite often in the literature that I've read treated quite externalized to the viable system. Whereas if we take the system one's environment as including the system, then we can see that in a slightly different light.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Who else? Do we have any more questions? Elena? Yes.
Yeah, well, very much enjoyed your talk, Kate. Thank you very much. One of the things I wondered about your opinion of is that it seems that in many senses, we're behind the 8 ball when it comes to timing, but also I think that in solving problems, we're too much in a hurry. We move to the transactional before we had enough understanding of what it is the transactions imply. I think that's one of the places that cybernetics can help, is with the idea of attaining enough shared subjectivity so that the transactions are understood and benefit both parties. And I think that that's really the challenge, and we don't have that much time to meet that challenge because there are too many vicious circles, like increasing inequality, that could explode on us.
Well, I'm very glad you liked the talk. I was very nervous about that. Yeah, I think I am trying to say we need to hurry up and slow down at the same time, and that's what design helps us with. And yeah, there's a lot of operationalizing, a lot of trying to move things, as you're saying, and without having very clear what are we moving. So Gigo, again, we need to slow down and ask ourselves, what is this that we are trying to do? I think this brings us back to the question of world government, which is a whole other issue. And there, I would come back to holarchies and to federalism. I think it's absolutely fundamental that the discussions about world government are engaging with questions of federalism. We are not cognitively capable of understanding ourselves as part of a planetary system.
Yeah.
So we have to understand ourselves as parts of villages, and those villages as parts of communities of villages, and those communities of villages as part of something bigger. That we can handle. And Alfredo, this comes back to the Holan. So, and we can handle that because it's holarchic. So we don't have to do anything more than sort of be an hour bit inside the system. But there's a lot of design work that needs to be done for that to work well. And so I guess there I would say political science is very conservative, law is very conservative, but these are the engineers of our institutions. And so perhaps part of it is that we need to get these people involved in the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Kate. We have Angus and then Martha.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I share your concern. I think probably like most, if not everyone on this conference, I share your concern about the state of the planet, human affairs, and that we see it as having many different aspects of concern. So it's all the more important that we converse together to try and find ways forward in it. And that we don't just share our feelings, but find ways of trying to understand it. And it's, as you say, there are many issues in that. So you covered a lot of interesting ground, and you brought a number of different types of ways of understanding the world, different systems, models, approaches, philosophies, and so on, some of which were at first sight perhaps normally considered incompatible and so on, or they're seen in different ways. And I thought that was all very interesting. And sometime, there isn't time now, I'd be interested in knowing more how you bring them all, how you don't bring them or do bring them into reconciliation. But what I'd like to do, if I might, is just home in on perhaps two things, but they're highly related, that you touched on, that personally I see as really important and that I think are very related to cybernetics and seem to have a place in what you were talking about. You've been talking about Holarchies all the way through. So the first is you mentioned Goethe at a certain point in your talk. And I'm wondering, you did not mention metamorphosis. And it's, I think, one of the most profoundly important, but very often unrecognized aspects of how to understand how in a genuine, authentic wholeness, as opposed to the kind of counterfeit wholeness that comes about when you just try and assemble parts as in a machine, but the genuine organic wholeness that belongs to ecology, how that actually functions. And I was wondering if you were familiar with metamorphosis as a way of thinking, because it certainly fits in with your immediacy that you talk about, participation and so on, and it belongs to every single plant, every single living organism on the planet. There's a second related one. You mentioned the hermeneutic moment, and I didn't quite follow exactly what you were getting at around that. But within the hermeneutic framework, which I think is, again, very consistent with cybernetics, a very helpful way of seeing how the interpretive element in which people interpret their world and follow it. There's a concept within it, which I imagine you know, hermeneutic circle, which provides a very interesting way of looking at how a whole is constituted in the detail of its actions, which are constituted by the whole. So the circle is a simultaneous whole and its localized detail. And that's exactly the same thing you find in metamorphosis, the simultaneous whole and the localized and individualized local difference. And I was wondering if you had if you were aware of these and how you saw them in relation to the thesis you've been bringing. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, my compliments on an elegantly formulated question. coherent, wide-reaching, and difficult.
Thank you.
So I would say with respect to metamorphosis, this is something that I did not have in mind, but as you say it, it seems to me obvious. And I very much would agree this is natural. And I would bring it back, not so much to Goethe at the moment, I have to work on that, but to Prigozhin. And in respect that from a biological point of view, and that's something I am familiar with, metamorphosis is a hard drive dynamic. Metamorphosis is pre-built into the ontogeny of an organism. So it is the realization of a butterfly to transform itself from a worm into a butterfly. So this means that all of the things that a worm is doing as it's constructing itself are directed toward configuring the preconditions necessary for the butterfly to come into existence. And in that respect, I find it a very helpful way of thinking about this call to action. What is possible? What is the ontology, or what types of ontology? So what is the ontology that makes it possible for us to design it? See, go ahead.
Would it be okay if I just said something briefly? I'm sorry to
Yes.
interrupt you.
No, it's perfect.
That's an important example. I agree, but I was thinking more of the fact that on a tree, for example, Goethe started off with leaves, and he recognized how every plant is a leaf, and every leaf on every plant is a plant. So every plant is a leaf, every leaf is a plant. And this is now standard science. That's how it's seen. So what you have, and the growing of a particular leaf on a tree in a particular place is situational. It depends on the situational context in which it finds itself. And in that sense, it is the plant responding to its environment. And we now know that plants have that kind of responsive, but it also belongs to the development of a human body in its situation. So, for example, the structure of the skeleton and the bones within it. But it also manifests in social behaviors. And the metamorphosis of a standard social behavior, such as a smile, can vary. No two smiles are ever unique, are ever the same between different people. So the variations in these patterns, if you like, which goes very much with Bateson, and yet they belong to a whole, and they constitute the whole as the whole constitutes them. It's a very interesting way, and I think it's very relevant to VSM.
Yeah, I'm going to have to work a bit more on your references to Goethe, because I don't
It's a wonderful thing to do, I assure you.
No, I believe you, and I'm sure it's very interesting. But I'm not up to the game today. Okay. But thank you for the invitation.
You gave so many different subjects. You brought in so much erudition. I wasn't up to all of it myself. So please,
fair enough.
Nobody can know everything.
No. Well, no, Goethe's dead. No, but so I would like to come to the other piece that you mentioned about circles and holes and the hermeneutic moment. And I do think in the same sense, in the same respect, we also can think about this being a part of how consciousness is being created. One of the discussions that I didn't bring in is Daniel Dennett's work on consciousness. And this is a Wittgensteinian approach to consciousness, which is about consciousness being an emergent phenomenon at both the individual and the collective level. And in that respect, I do think that there's a question of how you can't yell at somebody so they'll change their mind. And this is also what Bateson talks with us about. So then how are we inspiring this shift of consciousness? And I think that's something that comes up through a holarchy and is performed. And so that's why I end up with sacred beauty and love at the end, because that's a holarchical product, I suppose, and I hope. So I agree with this as well. And we need a little bit more hermeneutics. to be more hermeneutical.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angus and Kate. We have Martha, and then we have Hans Peter.
Thank you, Angela and John, and thank you, Kate. I'm sorry, my English is really not very competent for really talking what I would like. And also I understand, I would say half of the presentation because of the complexity, and I'm not an academic. I'm a world worker. I've been working all my life in all these. I'm a systems engineer, and that's what I've been doing. Really getting to see how technologies can really help on the appropriation of whatever you want to really enhance or articulate or whatever. Now, my question is maybe not for Kate, and maybe it's not a question, it's just maybe a reflection on that need of the world, of the social communities. Here we are a network of networks. That's the project I'm trying to promote, of how to get connected, because we cannot continue be like atoms flying, each one although we are on the social issues, but we still compete and all these things. How can we provide a context in order to really help all this consciousness that is coming, and we are seeing all around the world. So we are all asking for the academics to give us a clue, because as civil society, we are so much engaged in our actual problems, and the networks we're working with are not really networks. They continue to be hierarchical. So it's really about changing almost everything, and getting to share about how are those cells, that organizations, that models that we would like to connect and to be part of this fractal kind of way of organizing. That's our main focus right now, because I know that how to get organized, but also using the technologies to really get us all connected in order to continue permanent dialogues and dialogues and constructive dialogues to develop information management and content and learning from each other and exchanging, and the economy to be empowered among us first than the accumulative reward and looking things out there. So my question is, can we really think of some kind of organization, and can we work on that and move on to that? Because we're kind of paralyzed, and because I know that technology should be exactly like the image of that organization, being the nodes of these persons getting connected into networks, but the relationships would be really the object of what we should work. How are we going to relate with the earth, and how are we going to relate with each others, and how are we going to relate with ourselves, which are the first objectives. I mean, changing people's consciousness on their own, and before moving into the outside or at the same time. So it's just a reflection, and I really have found in Metaforum a lot of people that will really be very much kind of connected with all these ideas, and I'm asking if we can really get to promote some dialogues. We can really try to find the financiation for that, because now in Colombia we are on a space where the progressive president will kind of, maybe we can find some funds here, or with the cooperation, because we have a lot of cooperation for peace processes. Colombia like a lab, because we are really that as Kate said, a world lab of things that are happening here. So my invitation is really to think if we can promote something, some conversations that we have to maybe move forward in order to see how to apply and what do we have to apply? So work on that design that you were talking about, the importance of finishing this design, the design of these ideas, which is about how to collaborate and get a better world for all of us, and of course us as nature, responding to the planet's, I mean, being coherent with the planet that is our house. So that was it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martha. I would only have two comments briefly. As I've been saying, I think it's a very important project to, I think this, but I say it here more generally to make these things more concrete. One is, I would say, yeah, if we talk with John Lee, he's just put some things in the chat about this. But I would say one important aspect here is that it's not about finishing the design. The design will never be finished. Designing is the design. So it's about designing for designing. It's designing to be involved constantly and continuously in the work of designing. And this is the change in the chip, as one says here in Colombia. So that we don't imagine that somehow we have it finished. And in the other respect I would mention at the moment, I think it's very important to keep in perspective the federalism aspect, that there is not an illusion that somehow there's going to be a one-size-fits-all, that is not going to be the case. Part of the reason why we don't have data for Africa is because that's not the way that data is collected in Africa. So it's not that people in Africa somehow don't like to know about themselves, they just do it in different ways. Like in Ireland, there was no written language until the Roman script, but there was very elaborate law. So this holarchy and the heterarchy and federalist structures, I think, are really very, very important when we think about what is a concrete thing that can work. How can you be kind of federated ready in the design of the design process?
Yes, I agree with that. And so it is, what is that minimum things that we need to put in place in order for something to really ingranate? I don't know if that's the word that we can work like. So it's,
if I could figure that out, I'd publish a book on it.
Excuse me?
If I could figure that out, I will publish a book on that. Maybe Angus and I will come up with that later. He said he's willing to talk with me later. I think he could be very helpful on this front. But yeah, it's a question of formalization, and I don't think that we have it. Maybe we already have it in many forms, but I think it's a task to attend to, at least for me. We have to learn how to do that. I think it's worthwhile.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate and Marta. We have Hans-Peter waiting. Sorry, Hans-Peter, I didn't saw your message before, sorry.
Okay. Well, first of all, Kate, it was, of course, very interesting to listen to you as always. So I really enjoyed that. And I think that, we are not really willing. We have a kind of a epistemic modesty that is lacking, and we are not really willing to think about ourselves in a way where we would understand that we are not different from the beaver. The beaver is my really favorite example. And when you do statistics, the beaver on average does better things for the Earth than we do. And we have created a planetary emergency. And the question is, why are we doing this? And I think it's because we very often, I'll come to another point, but first, we very often give things a name without thinking about whether it's the right name. And then the name implies knowledge. You were using Anthropocene, right? And by talking about the Anthropocene, we think about it in a geological timescale. The Holocene was 12,000 years. What we are currently in is a transition into the post-Holocene, which will probably only be 100 years. It's arrogant to call it Anthropocene. It's not a scene, it's a transition. It's a very dynamic situation that we are in. And maybe the post-Holocene will not have human beings around to call it Anthropocene anymore. So I think that we need to be very careful with this. And then, that I really think very positive of Rudolf Barrow. And when you do the journey inside, then you get something, at least I get something that is very well expressed in a blog that George Sakrakalis wrote 2 years ago. The title was, "Why is Humanity So Stupid? A biologist tries to answer the question intelligently." And then he talks about, I'm not going in details, but he talks about that our brain evolved inherently to believe that the world doesn't change. And that we basically are in a world where things are not really changing. And that's what Karin Kuhleman used to really say, that we are very poor in handling probabilities. We don't see really trends. We don't react to trends. We have seen the trends 50 years ago. 50 years ago, I was already in Germany active and trying to do something about climate change. In 1973, we had the oil crisis. We could have done everything differently, but we didn't. And George is saying in his blog, the brain's priority is just to live another day. And so we do what is good for today, even if we then discover it wasn't good for tomorrow. And I think, understanding that we have this brain limitation and really taking this into account in all the things you are saying, I think would be really helpful. But I would like to hear your comment on that, that we really are focused on today and not on tomorrow.
Joe, I think it's a very interesting comment. I like the post-Holocene observation. I choose to use the term Anthropocene. I know that there's some controversy around it, and I think that there is good reasons. But I like very much the post-Holocene. What I would say is the Anthropocene might turn out to be a flash in the pan, as the saying is, which I think it pretty much is. But I'm struck also. I like very much this reference to the cognition, which I obviously think also is very important. I'm not so pessimistic. I think it's a mistake, and I think if you'll forgive me, I would even say it's quite a masculinist mistake to treat the human mentality as something that's bound up with now and today. You could even say it's a Euro-descendant masculinist, if not a Greco-Roman masculinist mistake, in that now and forever are very close to each other in a lot of cosmologies. And so when we think about now and forever and change, the idea that things change. Europeans think things don't change because Europe is an incredibly stable ecology. Japanese people do not think that things don't change. And Colombians do not think that things don't change because every once in a while a mountain falls over. And I think this is an important distinction in terms of the way in which different ecologies and cultural contexts are shaping how scientific knowledge has been produced. So I don't think it's that simple. And I think that this question of how humans experience our positioning in time is very important, but I'm much more optimistic. I think we are currently in a sort of a male adolescent testosterone fit as a species. I'm hopeful that we will be able to grow up and turn into good parents of humanity and get over the phase that we're in of the superhuman guy. We are used to heart as a model for the VSN. Yeah, and so I'm worried about this, and I agree that it's an issue. I think also it's very uncomfortable, and so again we come back to cognition, which you're making me think about here in a slightly different way, and I thank you for that. Human beings don't like to think about the fact that the next iteration of the planetary dynamics might be one that doesn't include humans. But that's very natural. That this is something that we're not particularly inclined to think through and not evolved to reflect upon. But I don't think that that means that we can't change our perspectives. So yeah, I think nihilism is a good option. I have great sympathy for nihilists, and I think that there's a lot there. So thank you. But I think we need to, so I'll bring it back, which is a conversation we've been having for a while now, Hans-Peter. I'll bring it back to this question that in modern science and in the cutting edge of that, like NASA, like cybernetics, we have to be very clear that if we are saying, so I call it mein Heidelberg-Problem von auf einem Baum, which I will explain in another moment, Hans-Peter. But we need to take very seriously that everything we say about the things we're studying also applies to us. And so if we are saying that there's this attenuated ontological bias associated with human cognition, it's our cognition too. And a part of that can be, for example, the idea that, well, I only think about myself because I'm a privileged white European male narcissist. So that's what I assume. And I'm not meaning you, nor do I mean whoever it is that you are referring to here. I don't, but I mean, there is a tendency to have this projection. And the richness of biological diversity and the richness of non-destructive schismogenesis is being able to sit with the differentiated complexity. And it's sitting with, living with, and making good use of the differentiated complexity. That's what makes living systems so successful, because they do that.
Well, I don't know if Hans-Peter wants a final word. I think that we are just in time to finish. But Hans-Peter? Right. Okay, so Kate?
Yeah, Elena has a beautiful comment there.
Elena has a nice comment. Elena, do you want to share it with everyone?
Well, this is a secondhand comment. I was part of a conversation where somebody talked about an article that they couldn't find anymore about dolphins having a deep discussion about whether or not they would have a civilization, and that they decided it would not be a good idea.
It was probably Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, wasn't it?
I remember reading that. I don't remember that particular passage.
Okay. Well, then if we don't have any more questions, we have just done it. Thank you very much, Kate. Really interesting conversation. And thank you everyone for coming. The next webinar is on the first week, Wednesday in April. And this is Carlos Jose, the Peruvian cybernetician, who's going to talk to us about an experiment that was before the CyberSyn project in Chile, that was done in Peru by his father, who was also a cybernetician. So it's just it's going to be an interesting explorations of further developments of cybernetics that started even before the CyberSyn project in Latin America. So hope to see you again in April, and thank you very much for coming. Okay.